That takes us to case number E, case 19-00777270. This is an officer-involved shooting case that the board discussed, I believe it was back in the month of August, if I'm not mistaken. And we have requested a response from APD in regards to several questions that our members had at that meeting and issues that were raised in the board's discussion. So I don't know. I'll ask query the board here if we have any desire to make a motion, or do we want to just have Commander Evans speak here? I think that seems to be the case. So Commander Evans, the floor is yours, and I imagine there may be some questions and discussion here for you.
Okay, good. Thank you, Chair Olivas. So I received this case back in August, and I have reviewed a lot of the material and some of your questions that were sent to us. And you have to forgive me, I'm working a couple different computers here to be able to get you the answers that you need. I don't know if you knew the outcomes of the FRB. It seemed to me that the question was more directed at the FRB and the outcomes of some of what was requested. So it appeared to me that on April 23rd, 2020, the board came to a finding or made a referral that IAFD will reopen the investigation to address concerns of policy, tactics, training, equipment, and supervision. The IC wasn't established, perimeter wasn't established, equipment wasn't utilized, a vehicle for cover, things like that. What steps were taken to secure the scene, to slow things down? Why wasn't it done? So they sent that out, and Commander Middleton provided a document providing an explanation of the incident command, steps taken to slow things down, explanation, approach. Then in June 11th of 2020, the FRB had identified a concern related to training specific to ensuring field supervisors were being evaluated when arriving on scene to critical incidents. The training academy that created reality-based training scenarios which encompass field supervisors' interactions with specialized units and their respective supervisors. So apparently what I gleaned from that was that they identified that the tactical officers that were working, it seemed to me, just looking at CADs, that the supervisors on scene just kind of sidestepped and said, hey, tactical's here, we'll let them handle it, and did not get as involved as maybe they could have. They started blocking off traffic and things like that. I could see where they were calling for units to block off traffic, but it didn't seem to me like they were guiding the actual approach. And from further investigation into some of the responses that I read, it appeared to me that this was coming off the shadow of the El Paso mass shooting, and officers were concerned that this was going to turn into that type of scenario. And they were also afraid that officers' vehicles or officers approaching would instigate some sort of shooting event, which was somewhat confirmed when they approached and the subject did go for the weapon in his waistband. So that was their explanation. They were afraid that anything could trigger this guy who was, according to reports, was pointing a weapon at cars and flashing a gun and pointing it at bystanders. It seemed to me from the documents that I read that they were concerned that he was going to be triggered into actually, beginning to discharge his firearm. And hence that's why they approached the way that they did. The document that was sent to the FRB definitely lacked, I won't say lackluster, it just didn't have a lot of the information, like there was no signature or anything like that on it, which made it kind of difficult for me to tell who authored it. but it seemed that several officers, this was in like I say, the shadow of the mass shootings in El Paso. They were afraid that it was a copycat, that sort of thing. A witness had come up to them and said that the subject had continued to lift his shirt and point and display his firearm. They were just concerned for the traffic and the foot traffic in the area. With that being said, my review, of course, I didn't reinvestigate this case. I'm trying to focus on our keeping our current cases current. That way you all have relevant material coming out of IEFD to review. This case happened back in 2019, August of 2019. But just in my review of the investigation, I can see where we've improved considerably over the years. And our investigations are much more thorough and efficient. So that was just some of my takeaways from this incident. I don't want to, like I say, reinvestigate and try to come up with my own findings or anything like that. But I can tell you that our investigations, I'm hoping in the future that when you receive an investigation from us at this point, that your questions are answered rather than being left, in this sort of state where you just don't know what happened. Yes, Dr. Cass.
Yes, I'd like to kind of fill in on some of the other background information because Commander Evans and I have had a couple of conversations in order to he asked what we wanted to hear, and I tried to provide some clarifying information. And I appreciate your answer to this, and I'd like to explore it a bit further. In that, one of the things that I recently saw was there was an article in the New York Times which described high risk traffic stops, and it was interesting in that it showed the what happened at the instant that shots were fired in a high risk stop where an officer shot a subject because they'd stopped him for something, and then it led at the end it ended in a shooting of an individual. And what the Times article laid out was the time that preceded that, the minute, and usually it was no more than a minute or 2 minutes that led up to the final result. And they wanted to show the circumstances of the complete event. And in a sense, the theme of this article was that there's a situation that they've named or characterized as officer-created jeopardy, which says that an officer creates jeopardy for himself in the actions that he takes leading up to a situation such as this. And I thought that this was appropriate in this particular officer-involved shooting case because there was approximately 10 minutes from when the urgent call went out until the individual was killed. And during that time, there was time. I mean, it seems to me that we should be looking at that time or what happened in the time between that final call out and the actual shooting occurred. And what could have happened was a plan could have been developed and as to how they were going to approach this. But it turns out that it was a mixed squad of some tactical officers who happened to be in the vicinity and field officers. And I think as a result of that, there was no leadership in the field to guide the operations of this sort of ad hoc unit of about 6 officers. And so there was no plan made. And it seemed to me that this was the ideal opportunity. There was time to do this, and so when they actually approached the victim, they did it without bringing cover with them, which, in my view, is a critical part of this kind of an operation. If they feel that their own lives are in jeopardy, a significant factor in that is that they had no cover. And that's also one way to avoid the process of putting yourself in jeopardy. So what I'm suggesting is that, there was no plan for him. There was no, in fact, very specifically, there was no cover. And because there was no plan, there was no de-escalation, that occurred. The shooting actually occurred within 1 minute. It was less than a minute between when the line of officers confronted the individual who was laying on his back on the sidewalk at that time, and when they actually all fired their weapons. It was preceded by 1 second by a beanbag round or 40 millimeter round being fired, but then the rest of the squad virtually immediately fired their weapons. So it seems that this is a case where we need to start applying the idea that that there's more necessity in terms of training or policy and to recognize that officers need not put themselves into this jeopardy where the outcome is going to be that the individual is the one who's killed. And since that occurred, I know that this occurred just before the most recent use of force policies were put into place. And so there was a de-escalation policy. There was de-escalation language in a policy, but there wasn't a specific de-escalation policy there. And so that became clearer. And I think there's been much progress in terms of de-escalation since this time. But even at the time of this event, there was training and there was policy around de-escalation, and that didn't occur. But it was excused by the idea that the officer's explanation was they didn't want to put cover there, which would have allowed them to, or bring cover, which would have allowed them to de-escalate for fear that would actually excite the subject. That seems to me to be a real training issue, and I presume that has been, but if it hasn't been, it should be addressed in training. So those were my concerns at the time, and I appreciate Commander Evans' input, and I think this is we have a good dialogue going. I think he's in the midst of reviewing use of force policies, and this is as you all know, we had a special meeting about this, and so I think this is a continuation of that. But I'm heartened to think that that the situation has improved. I just don't think we ought to dismiss this as something that we can't learn from. And I don't think that's happening, but I want to make sure that we take that into account in the future. And I think it's it'll, when we review these other two use of officer involved shootings, I think there'll be some something that we can apply from those as well. But in any case, I thank you for that, and I hope we can continue this discussion and get information that gives us better, creates better policies and creates better training and gets us the information that we need to understand these cases. So thank you.
Yeah, this case was the catalyst for some training that I'm looking at, and it's actually reality-based training. So it was well put together. Not to mention, I think I've seen more trainings in the reality-based training center regarding this type of thing and supervisors taking charge of scenes. So I think this is a case of where we've made the correction at the time and we're seeing it now. So I'm definitely seeing improvement now at our response to these critical incidents. And I agree. There's certainly cases where we can have time on our side and de-escalate, set up perimeters. And what I'm trying to avoid at all costs is what the Los Angeles PD had, where the subject, they were hesitant to use force on a subject and he ended up cutting someone's throat because of the officer's slow response. So there's a balance. And I understand an urgency. If a civilian had been shot or multiple civilians had been shot, we would be having a much different conversation. So we always have to consider that balance on a law enforcement response. do we always want to be behind the curve when someone's armed and showing intentions of using deadly force? We have to be very, very careful on how we restrict officers' response. And I know it's one of those sort of armchair quarterback things. It's easy for me to sit back and say those officers shoulda, coulda, woulda. They should have done this and done that. But we also have to play what if on worst case scenarios all the time. I want a very well-rounded police department, as I know you do, who makes good, solid decisions and respects the sanctity of human life. We just have to be very cautious about how we go about that. And when it's appropriate to de-escalate, we need to de-escalate. When it's appropriate for us to move in and take action, that we're not hesitating on that because we're afraid of criticism.
Do we have other questions for Commander Evans tonight? Yes, Member French.
Thank you, and I appreciate that. But there's a couple of questions that I have, and I appreciate you coming and answering our questions, and I want to hear from APD more so than the board members. This is my question on this, and I understand about anything can happen in a split second, but I've yet to hear why they didn't approach this man from his blind side. This man was asleep on the sidewalk, and as far as the El Paso scenario, he was nowhere near a Walmart. He couldn't have got to a Walmart. I know where Walmart is, and I know where this bus stop is. There's no comparisons with those two in my mind. But I've yet to hear why they didn't try to approach him from his blind side since he was asleep. And second of all, I also had questions about the disrespect for the man's body, flipping him here back and forth and back and forth. And also, I may be wrong, but I believe there was a comment about the time it took from the time they said he's still breathing until they started administering first aid or CPR. Then the second thing is when he needed more bandages for this gentleman, it seemed like all the officers walked off, but there was only one that either went to his car or had some bandages to help him try to stop the bleeding. So those were my questions, and I didn't hear any answers to those. But I do appreciate you saying, what, we learned from that. We hope, we're doing better. We hope to do better in the future. And we're using those type of things to make sure that we improve. I appreciate that. That's what I want to hear. But I still haven't heard answers to those other questions of mine.
That's a lot to unpack. That's a lot of questions, but I do appreciate it, Member French. Let me see what I can do about unpacking a little bit of that about things that I can speculate. I can only go by what the investigation revealed, and like I say, I'd like to think that my investigations now reveal much more to where you don't have these questions. I would hope. We may always have questions. I don't know, but it's a good thing that we're questioning. We should be questioning this sort of stuff. I can tell you that my approach in the field, when I approached an armed subject, it was typically based not by his blind side. It was based on crossfire with the general public. So I don't want to approach somebody who, if I have to engage in gunfire with this subject, to where I have maybe a bus stop behind the person or a store behind the person, or I'll usually try to put an open parking lot or something like that. I don't know if that's the case in this case, or maybe they erred. It's pretty unusual for tactical officers to err in that respect from a tactical approach. So I would like to think that they had a proper approach to the subject to keep the innocent civilians safe in the background. The backstop is what we call it if we have to engage. So that's just something to take into consideration with approaches. We want our safest approach, and then we also want to keep the general public safe from any sort of gunfire. As far as medical treatment, we're required to notify rescue immediately. About all I'm trained to do is apply bandages, and I don't carry any bandages. We aren't given them. We typically we're given a couple of chest seals and a tourniquet. So that's usually all we have on us. If they had more, it's probably because they bought it and had it with them. So I don't know. I didn't see that portion of it. I was more concerned with the force, of course, and I rhymed again. Sorry. But as far as disrespect for the man's body, I didn't. You kind of trailed off there. I didn't know what they were doing to disrespect. Can you elaborate on that or clarify?
Well, when they first had him on his back, then they flipped him over on his stomach, and then they flipped him back on his back. And then I think one time when they flipped him on his stomach, and then when they flipped him back on his back, he had been wallowing in his blood. So there was a lot of blood all over him, but it's just the way they flipped him back and forth. And so I don't know why, but as I said in the first meeting, I hope his family members don't view this. Maybe it was necessary, but it just seemed the way that they were handling the body, that it was in a disrespectful manner, whether he was dead or not, or whether they were trying to rush with the first aid. That's what I meant.
Yeah, typically when I see that type of movement, it's to check for injury because you're hastily looking for the holes, so you can plug them with chest seals or whatever you may have on you. That's what I would like to think. Of course, I can't speculate or answer for them. I can just tell you what I've seen in the past and what would be appropriate in a sort of hasty sort of rolling people over like that. I would also like to think that no one would disrespect another person in that way, in that manner to disrespect them, other than to render them aid. But yeah, it's just something to consider. I mean, we try to render aid after we use force, any type of force, and the more serious the force, the more serious our response is going to be to render aid to. Did I miss any of the questions? Was there more?
No, I think that's it. That's fine.
Okay, I'm sorry if I couldn't provide more. It's based on what's in the investigation, what's in my notes here. But hopefully in the future, we can satisfy those questions before you even have to ask them, I'm hoping.
Thank you.
Thank you, Member French.
Other members wishing to ask questions of Mr. Evans? Not seeing any. So at this point, the board's requested a response from APD. I believe that Commander Evans has made his best attempt to answer those questions and get us some more information on this case and on our questions regarding it. So we're certainly free to have further discussion on this case, or if we have any members that want to make a motion. And I would advise, I believe that per parliamentary procedure, we're at the point here where it's actually advisable we need to have a motion on the table here in order for us to proceed with further discussion, given that we've received Commander Evans' report and no members have further questions on that report. So is there a motion on this case?
I move that we accept Commander Evans' report on the subject, and we'll continue the conversation in other cases. But I just move that we accept Commander Evans' report.
We have a motion to accept the report.
I'll second that.
We have a motion and a second. Any discussion on this item? Yes, Vice Chair Galloway.
We've still not decided on this case. if I remember correctly. So is the intention to do something about that piece of it tonight? Or are we looking for more information from APD?
Dr. Cass.
Yes, I think our decision was that we would write a letter to APD asking for an explanation. And I don't believe there's, I don't know that there's any other action we can take. I mean, I believe we disagreed with the findings and we had further questions. And I believe I think that was decided. So I don't know what else is available. I think the process is a little bit nebulous here because what we actually have the authority to do is not very well spelled out, if at all.
Well, yeah, and I think that would be like the follow-up question to back up. With all of the cases, the use of force cases that we review, we either accept the findings of the FRB or we don't accept the findings of the FRB. The follow-up question would be, what happens if we don't accept the findings of the FRB? And I don't think there's anything that's laid out as far as that goes. It's not really our investigation to do anything with. We just say we don't agree with it, I think is what that is. But I don't think that we've hit that piece of the chain yet, where we say, yes, we agree with their findings or we don't. In my opinion, I feel like Commander Evans being here provides us with some more context to what was going on to be able to come to that determination. I think that was the idea behind it, if I remember correctly. But if we don't do anything, if we don't either accept or reject the findings of the FRB, it's out of our typical MO for how we process these things.
And I believe in the past, when this has typically been the case, we've adopted, for example, we've adopted the director's FRB findings or his non-concurrence with those findings. So I'm just providing that as a little bit of context, but I don't think that we've had a non-concurrence in this case to the extent that I think that the board is at in this case. This is a much more, generally a more complicated case than we've seen in the past, and I think the extent of disagreement here is probably wider.
I have a question.
Member French.
I have a question about the motion on the floor. I believe Dr. Cass's motion was that we accept Commander Evans' explanation. Is that what your motion was, Dr. Cass? And if so, how is that?
I used the word report, but that's
okay, report.
The essence of it.
Okay, so my question is, how is that relevant to, or is that necessary for us to decide on whether we accept or don't accept the findings? I'm not sure why we're making a motion whether we accept or don't. We just wanted an explanation from police. So could you explain that motion or why we're even voting on that?
Yes, I'm just trying to provide closure to this item on the agenda. And the item on the agenda was to ask for a report from APD. We received that report, and I'm moving that we accept the report. I think the other issues that have been raised have actually been dealt with. I think when we wrote the letter, we also, as I recall, accepted the findings of the executive director. And so I think that part is over. And given that we don't have a lot of guidance on this, and we're doing it as we think we should, I think we finished that part, and now we're at the part where we asked for a report, we received it, and I'm moving that we accept that report.
So I'm not entirely clear myself as to what set of findings, or I should say, if we adopted a set of findings at the previous meeting where this was discussed under the pretext of sending a letter to gain more insight from APD on their position and why the findings of the FRB were as such. I was under the impression at that time, what I can recall right now of that meeting, was that the intent of receiving this information was for the board to be able to make a more informed decision on what findings it would adopt or should adopt. Yes, Director McDermott.
Chair Leavis, I do believe that is correct, that the board, and this is going off memory, but the board did not actually make a finding in this case, and it wanted to have the more information from APD before making that decision. So the appropriate is, now that you have more facts to consider, then you would make your finding based on that information.
So I would argue from a procedural standpoint, we can still have this motion to accept the report. This is something that I think City Council regularly does on different items, essentially a receipt be noted or, response accepted type of thing, which I think is what this is. But I would just note that doesn't deal with the underlying issue on the case. So I think there's two issues here, and I think we're perfectly free to consider this motion. And we should. So if there's no more comments on this motion specifically, I would argue that we should move to a vote. Seeing nothing further, Ms. Barrera, would you please call the roll?
Yes. Member Crawford?
Yes.
Member French?
No.
Member Galloway?
Yes.
Member Dr. Cass?
Yes.
Member Olivas?
Yes.
Member Ralph?
Yes.
Thank you. That motion passed 5-1.
Thank you. So this item is still on the agenda. I believe that basically clears the request for an APD response. At this point, I think if members want to have more time to deliberate on this, we could entertain a motion to table this into December, or we could consider a motion at this time to adopt findings. Vice Chair Galloway.
Diane, by any chance, do you have Director Harness's his findings or his opinion on the findings of the FRB meeting with this case as well?
Chair Leavis, Vice Chair Galloway, no, I'm afraid I do not have any access to the director's findings for any of these use of force. It would have to just go back to reviewing the transcript, not the transcript, but the minutes or whatever from that meeting that it was discussed. But I don't have access to anything right now. So,
and he's not a voting member of FRB, so likely his opinion isn't going to be recorded in the minutes anyway. Okay, thank you.
Yes, Dr. Cass.
I move that we table this decision on this until the next meeting, at which time we'll be provided with the director's findings from the FRB and have time to consider the presentation and explanation by Commander Evans.
I'll second that.
We have a motion and a second. Any discussion on the motion to table this issue into December? Seeing none, Ms. Borrella, would you please call the roll?
Member Crawford?
Yes.
Member French?
Yes.
Member Galloway?
yes.
Member Dr. Cass?
Yes.
Member Nixon? Member Olivas?
Yes.
Member Ralph?
Yes.
Thank you. That motion passed.
Thank you. We'll see that case again on our next agenda.